The sun was setting over Pine Hills neighborhood, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Most people were heading home after a long day, ready to enjoy dinner with their families. The streets were quiet except for the rumbling sound of the garbage truck making its evening rounds. James Wilson had been working as a garbage collector for almost 15 years now. At 47, his dark skin had weathered many seasons on these streets. He knew every house, every corner, and most of the families in this part of town. Though some folks barely noticed him as he collected their trash each week, many others would wave or stop for a quick chat. James took pride in his work, keeping the neighborhood clean and tidy. On this particular Wednesday, James was finishing up his route on Maple Street when something caught his attention. A small figure was running down the sidewalk, moving faster than little legs should carry a child that size. As the figure got closer, James could see it was a young girl, no more than 8 years old, with blonde hair flying behind her. Her face was red and wet with tears. James set down the trash bin he was emptying and took off his work gloves. Something wasn't right. Children in this neighborhood didn't usually run around alone, especially not looking this upset. "Hey there," James called gently, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her more. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The little girl stopped in her tracks when she noticed him. For a moment, she seemed unsure, looking back the way she came, then at James, then down at her sneakers. Her small chest heaved with each breath as she struggled to control her crying. I need help," she finally managed to say between sobs. "Please." James knelt down to be at her eye level, his heart breaking at the fear he saw there. "My name's James. I work for the city picking up trash. What's your name?" "Emmy," she whispered, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "Emmy Taylor." "Well, Emmy Taylor, what's got you so upset? Where are your mom and dad?" At the mention of her parents, Amy's blue eyes filled with fresh tears. "It's my mom. She fell down and won't get up. I tried to wake her, but she won't move." James felt his stomach drop. "Where is she, Emmy? Is your house nearby?" The little girl nodded and pointed down the street, the blue house with the white fence. "I ran out to find help, but nobody was home next door," and her voice broke as she started crying again. Without hesitation, James reached for his radio clipped to his belt. "This is Truck 47. I've got an emergency situation. Possible medical emergency at the blue house with white fence on Maple Street. I'm heading there now with a child whose mother is unresponsive. Please send help immediately." The radio crackled back with confirmation as James turned to Emmy. "Let's go check on your mom, okay? My friends are going to send help right away." As they hurried toward Emmy's house, James noticed Mrs. Henderson watering her flowers. The older woman's eyes widened at the sight of the tall black garbage man rushing alongside the crying white child. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Henderson called out, concern evident in her voice. "Her mom needs help," James explained quickly. "Can you call 911 as well? Tell them blue house, white fence, woman unresponsive." Mrs. Henderson immediately dropped her watering can and rushed inside, her garment forgotten. Emmy was running now, her little legs moving as fast as they could. "This way," she called over her shoulder. James followed, his work uniform suddenly feeling too heavy in the warm evening air. They reached the neat blue house with its perfectly painted white fence. The front door stood half open, never a good sign. James felt a knot form in his stomach as they approached. He'd seen enough emergencies in his years on the job to know that whatever waited inside might not be easy to face. "Hello," he called loudly as they stepped onto the porch. "Anybody home? It's the sanitation department, here to help." No answer came from inside the house. James turned to Emmy, keeping his voice calm despite his growing concern. "Emmy, I'm going to go in first, okay? I want you to stay right behind me." The little girl nodded, her tear-stained face serious and trusting. It struck James how quickly children could place their faith in adults they barely knew when they were scared. That trust was a responsibility he didn't take lightly. They stepped into a tidy living room. Family photos lined the walls. Amy with a woman who must be her mother, vacation pictures at the beach, holiday gatherings. A normal, happy home where something had gone very wrong. "Mom's in the kitchen," Amy whispered, pointing to a doorway on the right. James moved carefully through the house, calling out once more before entering the kitchen. "Hello, ma'am. I'm here to help." The scene in the kitchen made James's heart race. A woman lay motionless on the tile floor, her blonde hair spread around her like a halo. A broken glass lay shattered nearby, water spreading in a small puddle. She was wearing workout clothes. Perhaps she'd collapsed while getting a drink after exercising. James rushed to her side, kneeling down carefully to avoid the glass. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He gently placed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but weak and fluttery. "Is my mom okay?" Emmy asked in a small voice from the doorway. James turned to look at the frightened child, trying to keep his expression calm and reassuring. "Your mom is sleeping right now, Emmy, but she needs doctors to help her wake up. Did you see what happened?" Emmy shook her head. "I was watching TV. I came to ask if I could have a snack, and she was on the floor." Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder. Help was on the way. James had never been so relieved to hear that sound. "You did exactly the right thing coming to find help," James told Emmy, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "You're a very brave girl. The doctors will be here any second now." Blue and red lights flashed through the windows as police cars and an ambulance pulled up outside. The quiet street was about to become the center of attention. James stood and moved toward Emmy, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's wait by the door so we can show the doctors where your mom is, okay?" As they walked to the front door, James couldn't help but wonder about the story behind this emergency and what would happen next to this little girl who had trusted a stranger in her moment of need. Blue and red lights flashed across the front of the small blue house, turning the quiet street into a scene of urgent activity. 2 police cars and an ambulance had pulled up, their sirens now silent but lights still spinning. Neighbors began stepping out onto their porches, curious and concerned about what was happening at the Taylor home. James stood at the front door with little Emmy by his side, waving to direct the emergency workers. 2 paramedics rushed up the walkway carrying their medical bags, while a police officer followed close behind. "She's in the kitchen," James explained quickly as they approached. "Found her unconscious on the floor. The little girl here is her daughter." The female paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, nodded at James before kneeling down to Amy's level. "Hi there, sweetie. My name is Linda. We're going to help your mom, okay? Can you tell me your name?" "Emmy," the little girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't let go of James's work uniform since they'd left the kitchen, her small fingers gripping the rough fabric like a lifeline. "Nice to meet you, Emmy. Can you tell me your mom's name?" "Karen. Karen Taylor." The male paramedic and police officer had already rushed inside toward the kitchen. Linda stood up and placed a gentle hand on Amy's shoulder. "Emmy, my friend and I need to help your mom now. Officer Thompson here is going to stay with you for a minute while we do that, okay?" The second police officer, a younger man with a friendly smile, stepped forward and introduced himself. "Hi, Emmy, I'm Officer Thompson. Is there anyone we should call? Maybe your dad or grandparents?" Emmy's bottom lip trembled. "My dad lives far away. Grandma lives in Preston Hills." James cleared his throat. "I should get back to my truck. It's still sitting on the street with the engine running." Emmy's grip on his uniform suddenly tightened. "Please don't go," she pleaded, fresh tears welling in her eyes. Officer Thompson gave James an understanding look. "Sir, would you mind staying with her for a few minutes?" Sometimes in these situations, it helps to have the first person who responded stay until things settle down. James nodded without hesitation. "Of course, my supervisor knows I'm here." He gently patted Amy's hand. "Don't worry, kiddo. I'm not going anywhere just yet." The second paramedic called out from inside the house. "Linda, we need you in here." Linda hurried inside, leaving James, Amy, and Officer Thompson on the porch. More neighbors had gathered at the edge of the yard, watching the scene unfold with worried expressions. Officer Thompson pulled out a small notepad. "Emmy, can you tell me your grandma's full name and maybe her phone number?" "Rose Taylor," Emmy replied, rubbing her eyes with her free hand. "I don't know her number, but it's in Mom's phone." "That's helpful, thank you. Do you know if your mom has any health problems? Does she take any medicine?" Emmy thought for a moment. She has to check her sugar. She pokes her finger and then writes the numbers down. James and Officer Thompson exchanged a meaningful glance. Diabetes. Does she take shots sometimes, or pills? The officer asked. Emmy nodded. Both. She doesn't like the shots. Just then, the front door opened wider as a stretcher was wheeled out with Karen Taylor strapped to it. An oxygen mask covered her face, and an IV line had already been started in her arm. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency. Emmy tried to run toward her mother, but James gently held her back. Let them do their job, Emmy. They need space to help her. Is my mom going to die? Emmy asked, her voice breaking. James knelt down beside her, looking directly into her frightened eyes. The doctors are taking good care of her. They're the best at what they do, and they're going to take her to the hospital where they have special medicine to help her. Linda approached them as her partner continued preparing Karen for transport. We're taking her to County General. Her blood sugar is dangerously low. She's in hypoglycemic shock. Has she been eating regularly? Officer Thompson looked to Emmy, who shrugged uncertainly. Mom says food is expensive now, Emmy said quietly. Sometimes she says she's not hungry and gives me her dinner. The adults exchanged concerned glances at this revelation. I'd found these in her purse, Linda said, showing them a nearly empty insulin pen and a glucose monitor with a critically low reading. Based on the log in her phone, she's been taking her full insulin dose, but possibly not eating enough afterward. A second police car pulled up, and an officer stepped out with an older woman. Amy's face lit up instantly. Grandma. Rose Taylor rushed forward, her arms outstretched. Emmy. Oh my goodness, what happened? While Andy ran to her grandmother, Officer Thompson stepped aside to explain the situation. James stood awkwardly by the porch steps, no longer needed but somehow unable to simply walk away. The paramedics finished loading Karen into the ambulance. Linda approached Rose and Amy. Mrs. Taylor, we're taking your daughter to County General. You're welcome to follow in your car with Amy. Rose nodded, holding her granddaughter close. Thank you, we'll be right behind you. As the group began moving toward Rose's car, Amy suddenly pulled away and ran back to James. Without warning, she threw her arms around his waist in a tight hug. Thank you for helping my mom, she said, her voice muffled against his uniform. James, surprised by the gesture, gently patted her back. You're the real hero, Amy. You knew exactly what to do when your mom needed help. Rose approached, extending her hand to James. I can't thank you enough for being there when my granddaughter needed someone. James shook her hand, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. Just doing what anyone would do, ma'am. Not everyone would have stopped to help a crying child, Rose said softly. Some might have just kept driving. Officer Thompson walked over, handing Rose a card. Ma'am, we'll need a statement later, but please focus on your daughter right now. This has my direct line if you need anything. As Rose led Amy toward her car to follow the ambulance, James finally turned back toward his abandoned garbage truck, now surrounded by curious onlookers. His supervisor had arrived and was redirecting traffic around the emergency vehicles. Wilson, everything okay? His supervisor called out. James nodded, looking back at the blue house where an ordinary afternoon had suddenly turned extraordinary. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing once more. Yeah, he replied thoughtfully. I think it will be. What had started as a routine garbage route had turned into something much more important. As James walked back to his truck, he couldn't help but wonder about little Amy and her mother. He made a mental note to check the newspaper over the next few days. Sometimes, he thought, the most important connections happen in the most unexpected moments. The waiting room at County General Hospital was busy that evening. People sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, some scrolling through their phones, others staring blankly at the muted TV mounted in the corner. Amy sat between her grandmother Rose and Officer Thompson, her legs swinging nervously above the floor. How much longer? Amy asked for the third time in 20 minutes. Rose patted her granddaughter's knee. The doctors are taking good care of your mom. These things take time. Officer Thompson had stayed with them, even though his shift had technically ended an hour ago. Something about the little girl's courage had touched him. Besides, he needed to file a complete report, and that meant getting information from the doctors. Would you like something from the vending machine? He asked Emmy. I think I saw some chocolate chip cookies down the hall. Amy looked up at her grandmother, who nodded. That would be nice. Thank you, officer. As Officer Thompson walked away, a doctor in blue scrubs approached. His face looked tired, but he offered a small smile as he reached them. Family of Karen Taylor, he asked. Rose stood immediately, placing a protective hand on Amy's shoulder. Yes, I'm her mother. This is her daughter. How is she? The doctor gestured to some empty seats away from the other waiting patients. Let's talk over here. Amy's heart pounded as they moved to the quieter corner. Grown-ups only wanted privacy when the news was bad. She'd learned that when they told her about her parents' divorce. I'm Dr. Chen, the doctor said as they sat down. Your daughter is stable now. She experienced severe hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, which caused her to lose consciousness. Will she be okay? Rose asked, her voice shaking slightly. We've got her blood sugar levels normalized, and she's awake now. But I'm concerned about why this happened. Dr. Chen looked down at his clipboard. Has Karen been having financial difficulties recently? Rose sighed, glancing at Amy before answering. She lost her job at the accounting firm about 2 months ago. They downsized the department. She's been looking for work, but it's been tough. I've been helping where I can, but I'm on a fixed income myself. Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. Based on our tests and what Karen told us when she woke up, she's been rationing her insulin and skipping meals to save money. With type 1 diabetes, that's extremely dangerous. Can I see my mom now? Amy interrupted, unable to follow all the medical talk, but desperately wanting to see her mother. Dr. Chen's expression softened. Yes, of course, she's asking for you, but just for a little while. Okay, she needs rest. Officer Thompson returned with the promised cookies, catching the tail end of the conversation. I can wait here if you'd like, he offered. Rose thanked him as a nurse appeared to lead them to Karen's room. Amy clutched her grandmother's hand tightly as they walked through the bright hallways that smelled of cleaning products and medicine. Karen's room was small but private. She lay in the hospital bed, looking pale but awake, with tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. When she saw Amy, her face lit up despite her exhaustion. There's my brave girl, she said, her voice raspy. Amy ran to the bedside, stopping just short of jumping onto the bed. Mom, are you okay? Karen reached out to stroke her daughter's hair. I'm better now, thanks to you. The doctors told me what happened. You were so smart to go get help. Rose approached more slowly, her face a mix of relief and worry. Karen, honey, why didn't you tell me things were this bad? Karen looked away, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I didn't want to be a burden. You're already helping so much with Amy after school. Your health is not a burden, Rose said firmly. Family helps family. That's how it works. A nurse entered with a tray of food and a small cup of pills. Dinner time, Mrs. Taylor. You need to eat all of this with your medication. As Karen began to eat, Amy suddenly remembered something. Mom, the garbage man helped you. He was super nice. He stayed with me until the ambulance came. Karen paused, fork midway to her mouth. Garbage man. Rose explained about James, the sanitation worker who had stopped to help Amy and stayed until the ambulance arrived. If he hadn't been there, who knows how long it might have been before someone helped. I need to thank him, Karen said quietly. What was his name again? James Wilson, Amy supplied quickly. He has a badge on his shirt. He told me stories while we waited for the ambulance so I wouldn't be scared. Outside in the hallway, a familiar deep voice caught Amy's attention. She turned toward the door just as Officer Thompson appeared with another unexpected visitor, James, still in his work uniform, but without his gloves and safety vest. Look who I found asking about you at the front desk, Officer Thompson said with a smile. James stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a small stuffed teddy bear. Sorry to intrude. I just wanted to check that everything was okay. My shift ended, and I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Amy rushed over to him. You came to see us. James knelt down to her level. Of course I did. I wanted to make sure your mom was all right. He handed her the teddy bear. And I thought you might like this. Being brave deserves a reward. Amy hugged the bear tightly before introducing James to her mother. Karen tried to sit up straighter in the bed. I don't know how to thank you, she said, eyes filling with tears. if you hadn't helped Emmy. James shook his head. No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same. Not everyone, Rose interjected. Not everyone would have stopped. We're very grateful you did. Dr. Chen returned, surprised to find the room crowded with visitors. I see the support team is growing, he remarked with a smile. Mrs. Taylor, I've spoken with our hospital social worker. She's going to come by tomorrow to talk about some programs that might help with your medication costs. Karen looked embarrassed again, but Dr. Chen continued gently. Many people are struggling with medical expenses these days. There's no shame in accessing available resources. As the conversation turned to medical details, Officer Thompson touched James's shoulder. We should probably let them have some family time. James nodded, but before he could say goodbye, Andy hugged him around the waist again. Will you come back tomorrow? She asked, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. James glanced at Karen, who nodded with a grateful smile. If it's okay with your mom, I'd be happy to stop by after my shift. As James and Officer Thompson left the hospital together, neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Officer Thompson broke the silence. You did a good thing today, Wilson. James shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But both men knew it wasn't that simple. In a world where many people would have driven past a crying child, James had stopped. Sometimes the simplest choices were the ones that changed lives forever. 3 days had passed since Karen Taylor was admitted to County General Hospital. The doctors wanted to keep her under observation to make sure her diabetes was properly managed before sending her home. Emmy had been staying with her grandmother Rose, who drove her to the hospital each afternoon after school. Today was different though. It was Saturday, and Amy had been waiting by the window since breakfast, watching for a familiar garbage truck that wouldn't be making its rounds on the weekend. Rose found her granddaughter with her nose pressed against the glass, the teddy bear James had given her clutched tightly in her arms. He said he'd come today, Amy said without turning around. Do you think he forgot? Rose smiled gently. It's only 10 o'clock, sweetheart. Give the man some time. He works hard all week. The doorbell rang just as Rose finished speaking. Amy's face lit up as she raced to the front door, nearly tripping over her own feet in excitement. Standing on the porch was James, dressed in jeans and a button-up shirt instead of his work uniform. In his hands was a colorful gift bag. James, Amy exclaimed, throwing the door open wide. You came. James chuckled at her enthusiasm. I promised I would, didn't I? And I always keep my promises. Rose appeared behind Amy, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Please come in. I just made some fresh coffee. Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. And please call me James. As they settled in the living room, Amy couldn't contain her curiosity about the gift bag. James noticed her staring and handed it to her with a smile. This is for your mom, he explained, but you can look inside if you want. Amy peeked into the bag and pulled out a beautiful houseplant with small white flowers. It's pretty. Mom loves plants. It's a peace lily, James said. They're good indoor plants, easy to take care of. Rose brought in coffee for herself and James, along with a glass of juice for Amy. That's very thoughtful of you. Karen will love it. How is she doing? James asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Much better, Rose replied. The doctors say she can come home tomorrow if everything looks good at her final checkup. Amy, who had been bouncing with excitement, could no longer contain herself. And guess what? Mom got a call yesterday about a job interview. It's at the library. She used to take me there all the time. James smiled warmly. That's fantastic news. We're heading to the hospital in about an hour, Rose said. Would you like to join us? I'm sure Karen would love to thank you in person now that she's feeling better. Before James could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. Rose went to answer it, returning moments later with Officer Thompson, now dressed in casual clothes rather than his uniform. Hope I'm not intruding, Officer Thompson said. I wanted to check in on the family. Amy jumped up. Officer Thompson, James is here too. We're going to visit Mom today. The officer smiled, noticing James sitting with his coffee. Well, looks like great minds think alike. Rose insisted that Officer Thompson join them for coffee, and soon the living room was filled with conversation. Emmy sat happily between the two men who had helped her family, occasionally adding to the story as they recounted the events of that frightening day for Rose. "By the way," Officer Thompson said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "that's not the only reason I stopped by." He pulled out some papers and handed them to Rose. "The department has a community assistance program for emergencies. I took the liberty of submitting Karen's case, and they approved some funds to help with her hospital bills." Rose's eyes widened. "Oh my goodness. That's... I don't know what to say." "No need to say anything," Officer Thompson replied. "It's what the program is for." James cleared his throat. "Actually, I have something similar to share." He seemed slightly embarrassed but continued. "I mentioned what happened to some guys at work and at my church. We took up a collection to help out." He handed Rose an envelope. "It's not a fortune, but hopefully it will help until Karen finds a new job." Rose opened the envelope and gasped at the amount inside. "This is incredibly generous. I don't know how to thank you all." Emmy, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Mom says when people are kind to you, you should be kind to others too. That's how the world gets better." The adults exchanged touched glances at the child's wisdom. "Your mom sounds like a smart lady," James said. "The smartest," Emmy agreed proudly. As the time approached to visit the hospital, they decided to all go together. Officer Thompson offered to drive, as his car was more spacious than Rose's aging sedan. The hospital seemed less intimidating during daytime visiting hours. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the hallways were busier with staff and visitors. They found Karen sitting up in bed, looking much better than she had a few days ago. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she was reading a book when they entered. "Mom!" Annie cried, rushing to hug her mother. "Look who came with us." Karen's face registered surprise at seeing not only James but also Officer Thompson. "I wasn't expecting a whole delegation," she said with a smile. "We come bearing gifts," Rose said, placing the peace lily on the bedside table. "This is from James." Karen turned to James, her eyes full of emotion. "I don't know how to begin thanking you. Emmy has told me everything you did." James shook his head. "Your daughter is the real hero. I just happened to be there when she needed help." "Sometimes that's all heroism is," Karen replied softly. "Being there when someone needs you." Officer Thompson stepped forward. "I have some good news to share, Mrs. Taylor." He explained about the assistance program and the community collection that James had organized. Karen listened in disbelief, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't understand. Why would strangers help someone they don't even know?" "Because we're not strangers anymore," James said simply. "We're neighbors." As the conversation continued, Dr. Chen stopped by to check on Karen. He seemed pleased to see the support group that had formed around his patient. "This is exactly what I like to see," he commented. "Recovery isn't just about medicine, it's about having people in your corner." Emmy, who had been whispering something to her mother, suddenly turned to James with a serious expression. "Mom says you should come to dinner when she gets home. She makes the best spaghetti in the world." James laughed. "Well, if it's the best in the world, how could I possibly refuse?" The hospital room filled with warm laughter, the sound of strangers who had become something more through an unexpected crisis. What had started with tears and sirens was transforming into something beautiful, a reminder that community could form in the most unexpected ways. A week had passed since Karen returned home from the hospital. The blue house with the white fence looked cheerful in the morning sunlight as Karen stood at the kitchen counter, carefully measuring her insulin dose. She had promised both her doctor and Amy that she would never skip her medication again, no matter what. Amy sat at the breakfast table, swinging her legs as she ate her cereal. "Is James coming for dinner tonight?" she asked between bites. Karen smiled at her daughter's newfound attachment to the garbage collector who had helped save her life. "Yes, honey, and Officer Thompson too. Grandma's bringing her famous apple pie." "The best pie in the world," Andy declared with absolute certainty. "The very best," Karen agreed, checking her blood sugar and recording the number in her logbook. The new glucose monitoring system provided by the hospital's assistance program made the process much easier. The doorbell rang, and Amy jumped up so quickly her chair nearly tipped over. "That's Mrs. Henderson," she exclaimed, rushing to the door. Karen followed more slowly, still regaining her full strength. Their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stood on the porch holding a large paper bag. "Good morning, dears," the older woman said cheerfully. "I brought those books I mentioned for your interview prep, Karen, and some fresh muffins for breakfast." "You didn't need to do that," Karen said, accepting the bag gratefully. "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson replied, stepping inside. "The whole neighborhood wants to help. What happened to you opened a lot of eyes around here. People forget that anyone can fall on hard times." After Mrs. Henderson left, Karen spread the library books across the kitchen table. Her interview was in 2 days, and she wanted to be fully prepared. It wasn't her dream job, but the library position offered good benefits, including health insurance that would cover her diabetes supplies. Emmy peered at the books. "Aren't you nervous about your interview, Mom?" Karen ruffled her daughter's hair. "A little, but it's good nervous, like butterflies before a school play." "You'll get the job," Amy said with complete confidence. "You're the smartest mom ever." The phone rang, interrupting their moment. Karen answered to find it was the hospital's social worker, Ms. Lopez, calling to check on her progress. "Everything's going well," Karen reported. "I've been following the meal plan Dr. Chen recommended, and I haven't missed a single insulin dose." "That's great to hear," Ms. Lopez replied. "And have you been able to connect with the community support group I mentioned? They meet every Tuesday at the community center." "Actually, yes. I went to my first meeting yesterday." Karen glanced at Amy, who was now drawing pictures at the table. "It was really helpful to talk with other people who understand what it's like." After finishing the call, Karen checked the time. "Sweetie, we need to get going. We have to stop by the police station before your dance class." Amy jumped up excitedly. "To see Officer Thompson?" "Yes, but it's a special visit. Remember I told you people wanted to hear our story? Well, the police department wants to recognize James for helping us. They're planning a small ceremony next week." "Like he's getting a medal for being a hero?" Amy asked, eyes wide. "Something like that," Karen smiled. "And they want to talk to us about what happened." At the police station, they were greeted warmly and shown to a small conference room where Officer Thompson was waiting with his supervisor, Captain Rivera. "Thank you for coming in," Captain Rivera said, shaking Karen's hand before kneeling to greet Amy at her level. "You must be the brave young lady I've heard so much about." Amy shyly moved closer to her mother's side. "I just found someone to help my mom." "And that was very smart thinking," the captain said kindly. "Not every child would know what to do in an emergency." Officer Thompson explained that the department wanted to recognize James Wilson with a Civilian Service Award at their monthly community meeting. "We'd like you both to be there if you're feeling up to it." Of course, Karen agreed readily. "Does James know about this?" Officer Thompson grinned. "Not yet. We thought it might be nice to surprise him." As they discussed the details, Amy listened with growing excitement. "Can I say something at the ceremony too?" she asked suddenly. The adults looked at her in surprise. "What would you like to say?" Karen asked gently. Amy twisted her fingers together nervously. "I want to tell everyone how nice James was. How he wasn't scary even though he was a stranger. How he told me stories about his kids while we waited for the ambulance." Captain Rivera nodded seriously. "I think that would be perfect, young lady. Sometimes the most important messages come from children." After leaving the police station, they headed to Amy's dance class. Karen sat on the bench outside the studio, watching through the window as her daughter twirled with the other children. Her phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Still oak for dinner tonight? My wife made her special cornbread to bring." Karen smiled as she replied. Over the past week, what had started as gratitude had blossomed into genuine friendship. James and his wife had visited twice already, and their teenage children had hit it off with Amy immediately. As she watched Amy dancing, Karen reflected on how quickly life could change. One moment she had been collapsing on her kitchen floor, and the next she was surrounded by a community she hadn't even realized existed. Neighbors she had barely spoken to before were now dropping by with casseroles and job leads. The local pharmacy had enrolled her in their discount program for her medications. And it had all started because a man in a garbage truck had taken the time to help a crying child. After dance class, they stopped by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. Karen was carefully checking prices when she heard someone call her name. It was Dr. Chen, pushing a shopping cart with his young son sitting in the child's seat. "Mrs. Taylor, how are you feeling?" he asked, walking over. "Much better, thank you," Karen replied. "I've been following all your instructions." Dr. Chen smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. Oh, I wanted to let you know, the hospital is organizing a fundraiser next month for our patient assistance program. The one that helped with your medical supplies. We're looking for speakers who can share their experiences." Karen hesitated, her natural shyness making her uncomfortable with the idea of public speaking. "You don't have to decide now," Dr. Chen added quickly, "just something to think about." Emmy, who had been listening intently, tapped on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, you should do it. You told me we need to help others like people helped us." Karen looked down at her daughter's earnest face, once again struck by the wisdom that sometimes came from 8-year-old minds. "I'll think about it," she promised Dr. Chen. As they finished their shopping and headed home to prepare for dinner with their new friends, Karen felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in months. Her illness had been frightening, but it had also torn down walls she hadn't even realized existed in her neighborhood, walls between strangers, between different races and backgrounds, between those who needed help and those who could offer it. Sometimes, she thought, it took a crisis to remind people of their common humanity. And sometimes it took a little girl's courage to show adults the way. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filled the rows of chairs. A small stage had been set up at the front of the room, decorated with the city flag and a banner that read Pine Hills Community Recognition Ceremony. Karen sat in the front row with Emmy beside her, both dressed in their Sunday best. Rose sat on Emmy's other side, proudly patting her granddaughter's carefully braided hair. "Is James here yet?" Emmy whispered, craning her neck to see the entrance. "Not yet," Karen replied. "Remember, it's a surprise. Officer Thompson is bringing him." Emmy bounced in her seat, barely able to contain her excitement. In her lap, she clutched a small handmade card she had created for James, covered in glitter and crayon drawings of ambulances and garbage trucks. The room continued to fill with people, neighbors, police officers in uniform, city officials, and even some of the hospital staff who had cared for Karen. Dr. Chen waved from across the room where he sat with his wife. Ms. Lopez, the social worker, stopped by their seats to say hello before finding her own place. "I didn't realize it would be such a big event," Karen whispered to her mother. Rose smiled knowingly. "Word gets around. Good news travels fast too, not just the bad stuff." Mayor Williams, a tall woman with short gray hair and a warm smile, approached the podium. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our monthly community recognition ceremony. Tonight is special because we're honoring ordinary citizens who have done extraordinary things for their neighbors." As the mayor continued her opening remarks, Officer Thompson appeared at the back of the room with James and his family. James looked confused, dressed in slacks and a button-up shirt instead of his usual work uniform. His wife walked beside him, smiling secretively, while their teenage son and daughter followed. Emmy spotted them first. "They're here," she whispered loudly, pointing toward the entrance. Officer Thompson guided James and his family to reserved seats in the second row, just behind Karen and Amy. James leaned forward with a puzzled expression. "What's going on?" he whispered. "Thompson just said there was a community meeting I should attend." Before Karen could answer, the mayor's voice drew their attention back to the stage. "Our first recognition tonight is a special one," Mayor Williams announced. "We're presenting the Civilian Service Award, which is given to non-emergency personnel who go above and beyond to help others in crisis. Captain Rivera from our police department will present this award." Captain Rivera approached the podium, holding a framed certificate and a small medal. "3 weeks ago, one of our citizens faced a life-threatening medical emergency. What could have been a tragedy was prevented because 2 people, a brave young girl and a sanitation worker who stopped to help, took the right actions at exactly the right time." Emmy straightened in her seat, her eyes wide as Captain Rivera continued. "I'd like to call James Wilson to the stage." James looked stunned as his wife gently nudged him to stand up. The room erupted in applause as he made his way to the stage, his expression a mix of embarrassment and confusion. "Mr. Wilson," Captain Rivera said, shaking his hand, On behalf of the Pine Hills Police Department and our entire community, we present you with the Civilian Service Award for your quick thinking and compassion when you stopped to help a child in distress and provided life-saving assistance to her mother. James accepted the framed certificate, looking out at the crowd in amazement. I don't know what to say. I was just doing what anyone would do. Not everyone would have stopped, Captain Rivera pointed out. Not everyone would have stayed. Your actions remind us all what community truly means. The captain turned back to the audience. We also have a very special person who would like to say a few words. Annie Taylor, would you come up here? Annie froze momentarily, suddenly shy with all the eyes in the room turning toward her. Karen gave her a reassuring nod, and Amy slowly made her way to the stage, clutching her handmade card. James knelt down to her level as she approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. Amy took a deep breath and looked out at the room full of people. My name is Amy Taylor. 3 weeks ago, my mom got really sick and I was really scared. Her small voice gained strength as she continued. I ran to find help and Mr. James stopped his garbage truck to help me. She turned to look at James. He wasn't scary even though he was a stranger. He was nice and told me everything would be okay. He held my hand and made me feel brave. Amy unfolded her card and handed it to James. Thank you for helping my mom. She's my best friend in the whole world, and because of you, she's okay now. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as James accepted the card, visibly moved by the child's simple but heartfelt words. He gave Amy a gentle hug before she returned to her seat. Maynard Williams returned to the podium, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. This is what Pine Hills is all about. People helping people regardless of who they are or where they come from. After the ceremony, people gathered around James and the Taylor family, shaking hands and offering congratulations. Local newspaper reporters took photos and asked questions for their community section. Karen found herself telling their story over and over, but she didn't mind. Each retelling reminded her how fortunate they had been, not just because James had stopped to help Amy, but because that one moment had connected them to a wider community they hadn't fully known existed. As the crowd began to thin, James made his way over to Karen and Amy with his family in tow. Did you know about this? He asked, still looking slightly dazed by all the attention. Karen laughed. Why do you think we kept inviting you to dinner? We had to make sure you'd be around when Officer Thompson invited you tonight. James shook his head in disbelief. I never expected anything like this. I was just doing my job. Stopping to help a crying child wasn't in your job description, Karen pointed out gently. You went above and beyond. You deserve this recognition. James's wife, Patricia, put a hand on her husband's shoulder. I've been telling him the same thing. He comes home with stories all the time, helping elderly residents with their bins, looking out for kids walking home from school. That's just who he is. As they talked, Dr. Chen approached their group. Mrs. Taylor, have you thought any more about speaking at our fundraiser next month? Karen hesitated briefly before nodding. Actually, yes. I'd like to do it. Our story might help other families who are struggling with medical costs. Wonderful, Dr. Chen said. And Mr. Wilson, would you consider joining her? Your perspective would be valuable too. James looked surprised but agreed readily. If it helps others, I'm happy to do it. As the evening wound down, they all walked out to the parking lot together. The spring air was mild, and stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky. Amy skipped ahead, still buzzing with excitement from the ceremony. You know, Rose said thoughtfully, when I was growing up, people knew their neighbors. They looked out for each other. We seem to have lost some of that over the years. Maybe we're finding it again, Karen suggested, watching as Amy chatted animatedly with James's teenage children. One crisis, one child brave enough to seek help, one man kind enough to stop. Sometimes that was all it took to remind a community what really mattered. 6 months had passed since that frightening day when Amy ran down the street looking for help. Autumn had returned to Pine Hills, bringing cooler temperatures and colorful leaves that crunched underfoot as people walked through the neighborhood. Karen stepped out of the library, locking the door behind her as her evening shift ended. She'd been working there for 5 months now, and the job had turned out to be perfect for her. The health insurance covered her diabetes medications, the hours meant she could be home when Emmy returned from school, and she loved being surrounded by books all day. "Ready for the big event?" asked Diane, her coworker, as they walked the parking lot together. "As ready as I'll ever be," Karen replied with a nervous smile. "Emmy's been practicing her part all week." Today was the grand opening of the Pine Hills Community Health Center, a project that had grown from a simple fundraiser into something much bigger. What had started with Karen and James sharing their story at the hospital event had sparked something in the community, a recognition that too many families were one medical emergency away from disaster. Karen drove home quickly, finding Emmy already dressed in her favorite blue dress with Rose helping to fix her hair. "Mom," Emmy called excitedly. "Grandma says I can wear the sparkly hair clips." "Of course you can," Karen laughed. "You're one of the special guests after all." They arrived at the community center half an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was already filling up with cars, and a large banner hung over the entrance. Pine Hills Community Health Center, Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Inside, the space had been transformed. What had once been an underused wing of the community center was now a small, but well-equipped health clinic. Examination rooms lined one hallway, while the larger area had been converted into a waiting room and education space. James and his family were already there, helping to set up chairs. His wife Patricia waved when she spotted them. "There's our celebrity family," she called out warmly. "Emmy, you look beautiful." Emmy twirled to show off her dress before running to help James's teenage daughter arrange programs on the seats. Mayor Williams approached Karen with an outstretched hand. "Mrs. Taylor, thank you again for all your work on this project. Your story really moved people to action." "I just shared what happened to us," Karen said modestly. "The community did the rest." "Sometimes all people need is to see a problem clearly," the mayor replied. "When you and Mr. Wilson spoke at that first fundraiser, you put a face on an issue many people didn't realize was affecting their neighbors." Within an hour, the room was packed. Local businesses had donated funds for the clinic equipment. The hospital had arranged for doctors and nurses to volunteer their time. The pharmaceutical company that made Karen's insulin had established a medication assistance program that would be administered through the center. Dr. Chen, who had agreed to oversee the medical side of the operation, took the podium to begin the ceremony. "6 months ago, a medical emergency nearly took a mother from her child," he began. "Today, we open a center that will help prevent such emergencies for countless families in our community." As the ceremony continued, James found himself sitting beside Karen in the front row. "Did you ever imagine that day would lead to all this?" he asked quietly. Karen shook her head. "Never. I was just a mom with diabetes who lost her job and couldn't afford her medication. Now look at what's happened." When it was time for the ribbon cutting, Mayor Williams called Amy and James forward to hold the large ceremonial scissors together. The crowd applauded as they cut the blue ribbon, officially opening the Pine Hills Community Health Center. Afterward, as people toured the new facility, Amy tugged on James's hand. "Remember when I ran to your truck that day? I was so scared." James knelt down to her level, just as he had done that first day. "I remember. You were the bravest kid I'd ever met." "I wasn't brave," Emmy said thoughtfully. "I was just trying to help my mom." "That's what bravery is," James told her. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Later, as the crowd began to thin, Karen found herself standing with James and Officer Thompson near the new reception desk. "So," Officer Thompson said with a smile, "what's next for Pine Hills now that we have our health center?" Karen laughed. "Maybe we should all take a break before starting another project." But even as she said it, she knew that something fundamental had changed in their community. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other by name. Neighbors checked in on elderly residents during hot weather. The local pharmacy had started a medication donation program for people who couldn't afford their prescriptions. One small act of kindness had grown into something that would help hundreds of families. As Karen watched Emmy proudly showing Rose around the new center, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Sometimes the worst moments in life led to the best changes, and sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, even from a garbage truck on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon.